Okay, you're good.
Good. Thank you so much. Well, thanks for having me here. As Riona said, I'm Evan Andrews. I am living in St. John's and working at Memorial University with the Ocean Frontier Institute and Too Big to Ignore. Today, I will present my doctoral research called Fisher Behavior and its implications for the governability of Atlantic Canada's inshore fisheries, or what I'm sort of thinking about as a facilitated break from the US election and the crazy news. So if anybody hears any updates about that during this hour that we have, please keep them to yourself because they will affect me deeply. So, what is fisher behavior? Fisher behavior is quite simply individual and group actions of fishers taken in response to their mental processing and social negotiation of change in fisheries. And the key here is that behavior includes both the decision making and action in response to change. So, behavior becomes a very important part of broader change processes in coastal fisheries. And we can understand that in terms of individual fishers, so a skipper or a crew member, or different groups such as households, crews, or even fleets. And I'm going to be speaking about governance and governability. And so I just wanted to share what my perspective is on those things. Governance here is the principles, rules, rule-making systems, and management strategies taken to address change and advance sustainability in fisheries, whereas governability is a concept that helps describe the total capacity and ability to do those things, including the ability of people involved in governance to address change. So today I'm going to take you through an overview of my introductory material from my dissertation, followed by 3 empirical chapters, and then I'll conclude with some overall contributions and takeaways from my research, and then we'll have, about 20 minutes to have to answer any questions. So why do we need to understand fisher behavior? Fisher behavior helps us, provides a lens into the social aspects of change in coastal and marine fisheries, where most of that understanding in Atlantic Canada is coming from useful but limited economic assessments and some instances, local and traditional knowledge. Social scientific knowledge about fisher behavior can help strengthen the governability of, quite frankly, intensifying change in inshore fisheries. And we know in Newfoundland and Labrador, the perspective shift from shellfish to groundfish is one of those changes for which fisher behavior can really help us understand. Further, fisher behavior helps with research that helps with the recognition of fisher behavior as this interdisciplinary subject of social science is useful because it provides lessons on how to advance diverse decision-making objectives for coastal fisheries that are formalized in Canada's recently amended Fisheries Act. Excuse me. So the purpose of my research that I'm going to share today is to advance a comprehensive understanding of fisher behavior and make recommendations to strengthen the governance of Canada's Atlantic inshore fisheries with this recognition of what fisher behavior is. And so to do that, I have 3 objectives. The first was to critically examine fisher behavior in scientific literature. And so that I'll share as a global review of different types and explanations of fisher behavior. The second is to cultivate evidence about fisher behavior and its motivations in relation to change in Newfoundland and Labrador. And that's a local application that can take conceptual outcomes from the systematic review and apply them, in this case, to the Great Northern Peninsula. And the third is to identify strategies to strengthen the governability of Canada's Atlantic inshore fisheries. And in doing so, I consider barriers and opportunities to incorporate fisher behavior in things like science, policy, and management. And in other words, I take this nice global scan and a local application and come out with some evidence and implications for the 3 Atlantic management regions for fisheries and oceans Canada, the Gulf region, the Maritime region, and the Newfoundland and Labrador region. So, as is important for PhD research and other research more broadly, I did a pretty extensive literature review that reveals a comprehensive understanding of fisher behavior does not yet fully exist. And so there's areas to build new lessons about theory, evidence, and also practice that contribute to our understanding of fisher behavior as a part of change and also as a construct and subject of social science that can be recognized in how we develop policy and implement that policy and ultimately improve governance outcomes. And so the literature review is a little neat because it situates fisher behavior and decision making in relation to policies and the governance needed to develop and implement those policies. Previous research has really examined how governance is strengthened through rules that can sometimes reduce or ignore social complexity related to fishers' behavior in fisheries. And so rationalization, while had some benefits, is an example of this sort of top-down reasoning for strengthening governance. And my research works in the other direction. By understanding fisher behavior as this socially complex part of change and thinking through how that complexity can be recognized in policy and what are the broader implications for governance and governability. So I identified a number of gaps here, and my 3 empirical chapters are going to address these gaps. Basically, we have a limited understanding of the different types of behavior, and we need to know that to effectively represent them in things like models. Second, we need more evidence on the explanations for fisher behavior, so those goals and factors that tell us what fishers are likely to do in different situations, and that, of course, is also important for modeling and decision making. And third, fisher behavior represents different ways to think through diversity in fisheries, and we'll come back to that in one of my chapters that I'll talk about. Ultimately, by understanding a bit more about fishers as a focus and a policy, and ultimately lens into different kind of factors in local areas that fishers are negotiating and responding to, research on fisher behavior can tell us something about the local context and how to advance policies that match the local context. Taken together, I'm going to talk a little bit further about how lessons derived from examining these gaps can provide strategies to strengthen governance and governability with fisher behavior in mind. And so I've done these gaps shape a kind of conceptual framework for that guided my 3 pieces of research that I'll share today. And essentially, it's working from the bottom to the top. So using this better understanding of fisher behavior to reveal the context for fisheries policies, and then thinking about how to account for fisher behavior and governance. So now I'm going to take you through to some results which will be definitely, hopefully interesting for you. And the first one is from a systematic scoping review that I did of fisher behavior in coastal and marine settings, and this will come out in Fish and Fisheries very soon. The purpose of this research was to do that systematic scoping of fisher behavior in terms of different types and explanations to better understand some implications for fisheries governance. And so I asked a series of questions such as what's the state of the literature, what types of fisher behavior exist in the literature, what are the goals and factors being used to explain fisher behavior, and using that, what can we talk about in terms of implications for governance. The first key finding that I think is important is that I scoped a typology of fisher behavior, and this typology provides a multifaceted understanding of different fishers' actions in response to change and uncertainty, both in marine environments and coastal communities. And this is a graphical representation of the typology that I wanted to walk you through a little bit today. In the blue circles, we have things referred to as behaviors referred to as tactical behaviors. And so those are things like compliance, are people following rules, discarding what fish are fishers landing or not, and effort, so sort of where and how much fishers are fishing in key fishing grounds. In the yellow circle are strategic behaviors, and these reflect more longer-term community-based responses. Things like how and when are fishers investing in the fisheries? Are they buying new licenses and when, or new vessels? Are they diversifying their income? So are they moving a little bit outside of the fishery to supplement their household income? Are they entering or exiting, and how and why are they entering and exiting the fishery? And are they participating in individual and collective action? And so you find research all over the place that is about maybe one or two of these things, but this typology allows us to think through multiple actions and their relationship to change processes. And by examining this typology in the research, I found a few things out. First is there's a tendency to not consider behaviors in the yellow space. And secondly, there's a tendency to study single behaviors or a few behaviors together rather than thinking through a fisher behavior as a linked set of actions that tell us something about the broader change processes in fisheries. So the second finding that I think is interesting is that this systematic review revealed the need to broaden the evidence base for motivations of fisher behavior. We tend to think that fishers are driven exclusively by profit. And research on fisher behavior says, okay, well, there's definitely some of that, but there's also other goals that fishers hold in fisheries. So, for example, good relationships, good experiences, community well-being, and that they're considering lots of different factors in their individual and group decision making that help shape their pursuit or actions towards those goals. And in particular, this social network that I developed really highlights that there are sort of groups of different kinds of factors that are under-examined. And you'll see I highlighted psychosocial factors and governance factors because I think those are very important. You know, everybody has a brain, and fishers are thinking about different changes, in particular changes in things like rules. And so my research will pick up a little bit on this gap in the next chapter. So that provides a big global overview of fisher behavior and some of its motivations. And if you're interested, I can share the paper when it does come out. Now I want to take you to the Great Northern Peninsula, where I applied this typology to fishers' experiences over time. And so the purpose was to really get at those evidence-based insights about patterns of fisher behavior over time and motivations that change behavior. And I was specifically interested in psychosocial explanations of fisher behavior. And I looked at fishers' emotions, perceptions, and values, such as different forms of well-being. So I used a narrative analysis approach, which was really just that I sat with many fishers, and we sat for upwards of 5 hours, and I just asked them questions about their responses to change across their entire lifetimes, and this was done in a storytelling way. So I think it was a great, an easier way for fishers to talk about their experiences and responses to change. And also it's a way that allows us to actually look for things like emotions and values and perceptions in a sort of valid way. So it's a great way for folks to self-report their psychosocial experiences. And I worked the analysis in three ways. First, I documented single narratives. So I sat with one fisher. I took their life story and turned it into one um, single narrative about behavior, one pattern of behavior. Then I compared across all of the fishers' patterns of behavior. And so those patterns were treated as a unit of analysis and then grouped, which will become more apparent in just a second. And then I looked within and across those different patterns of behavior to understand the psychosocial experiences. So I'm going to start first with an insight about values. And in my analysis, values, so fishers' goals in the fishery, were associated with groups of livelihood pathways or patterns of behavior and outcomes. In other words, values told us something about what fishers wanted in the fishery and how they were grouped in the fishery. When we often think about, the size of the boat or type of license, values provided a different way to group fishers. And I'm just going to walk you through that a little bit. So inshore fishers that I spoke with held multiple forms of well-being or different goals in the fishery. However, they reported that their behaviors tended to advance a single form of well-being. So there were one group of fishers that said while they did most of their behavior in relation to advancing material well-being or, increased profit catches and material goods, there's another group of fishers that said that they advanced their behavior towards relational well-being. So different, good, positive relationships in the community, fishing with family, and these sort of things. And I put an example here of a quote by a fisher whose behavior tended towards relational well-being throughout their lifetime. And I'm just going to give you a minute to read that. It has an accent in there that I don't want to do here. So this is an example of one behavior by this fisher in a pattern of their behaviors that was largely informed by relational well-being. And we can see that that relates to things like fishing with his three sons, for example. There was also some indication in these types of fishers that they also adapted their behavior for emotional experiences. So, this is one case where not only did this fisher pursue good relationships, but also gleaned some pride or a positive emotional experience from that. In addition, I found that there were some instances where fishers changed their behavior completely just for the purpose of a positive or negative emotional experience in the fishery. But also, I found instances where fishers were changing their behavior towards different values. So they might have pursued material well-being, but then one situation they decided to exit or re-enter according to relational well-being. And these sporadic changes were really shaped by a combination of values, emotions, and perceptions. And I recorded two patterns of that, and this may be more detailed than you need, but I thought they were kind of interesting. Is that the first that that reported hope for the future? So, for example, increases in allocations, along with expressing uncertainty about whether those allocations would come, they tended to change their behavior. And one example is that Fisher's reported that most of his behaviors were related to relational well-being, but he said he had hope for the potential return of cod stocks, was uncertain whether allocations would increase, and made a major investment. But after he quickly realized that he threw good money after bad, and he said things went downhill. And then after that, his behavior remained oriented towards relational well being. The second pattern was about fear, and it related to fishers expressing certainty that allocations, catches, and landings would not improve. They associated this with a negative emotion, namely fear, over uncertainty for having to leave to an unfamiliar place, so having to outmigrate. This led to them pursuing material well-being despite the personal economic consequences of that. And one fisher really said she had fear over the unknown. She said they could improve their material situation, but they weren't sure it was going to happen. She asked, where are we going to go even? So why is this analysis important? Well, values, perceptions, and emotions play a role in Fisher's behavioral change and are therefore important to implement policies that address behavior. And we can think of those policies such as access and allocation policies, also policies related to compliance and enforcement. So these are policies that are used quite frequently in a fishery to manage change, and values, perceptions, and emotions of fishers relate to how that policy is going to be implemented and how fishers are going to respond to that. Also, we tend to think of, like I said, fishers as pursuing profit only, and I think this research suggests in a small way in Newfoundland that there are some other things going on there. That fishers may hold different goals, and those are attributed to emotional decision-making processes and a lot of uncertainty over their future, and those things shape behavior, which is quite a different model of fisher behavior or of human behavior that says fishers pursue a profit exclusively. So how can we use this knowledge to strengthen governability in Canada's Atlantic inshore fisheries? And this takes me to my last empirical chapter with the purpose of identifying strategies to strengthen the governability of inshore fisheries. And remember that I was going to consider some barriers and opportunities. And I did that by using different perspectives in empirical research to understand those barriers and opportunities to incorporate fisher behavior, and then situate this kind of perspective, future-oriented analysis in the current capacities to address fisher behavior. The first thing that I wanted to share with you is that there is a supply and demand problem in how knowledge of fisher behavior is supplied to meet demands made in fisheries policies. In other words, there's a lot of fisheries policies that directly relate to things like effort, discarding, and compliance, or entering, investing, and exiting a fishery. But the supply of knowledge towards those things was relatively inconsistent across regions and in fisheries management areas. And there was limited social science generated about those things, but there was some, and things like vessel monitoring, catch per unit effort. These are, by definition, behavioral science generating activities. Also, some folks from DFO who participated in this research really helped me understand that there are policies outside of the federal jurisdiction, of DFO's jurisdiction, that relate to behavior. For example, the province and other federal ministries have policies that relate to diversification in communities and out migration. And this highlighted the potential to think more broadly about governance beyond exclusively the regulatory responsibilities of DFO related to fisher behavior. And so I asked those DFO interviewees what they thought the barriers and opportunities were to more strongly and consistently incorporate fisher behavior and its motivations into their work. And I recorded 6 factors related to methodological and organizational barriers and 1 sort of interjurisdictional opportunity. The first was that DFO interviewees expressed concerns methodologically about how they might incorporate knowledge, social science about fisher behavior, particularly in the stock assessment process, and there were concerns over disrupting the sound and rigorous way of operating. There was also unfamiliarity with what interdisciplinary social sciences were and how they would be relevant across the policy process. Organizationally, DFO interviewees reported a limited number of social scientists in DFO as a barrier. So that's expertise that could interpret social science knowledge of fisher behavior and its motivations. Captured by one interviewee who stated, we don't have that branch here. DFO interviewees also described workloads or heavy workloads as constraining their opportunities to be more proactive and anticipate behavior. And interviewees told me they were just quite simply too busy putting out fires and dealing with crises to have the capacity to innovate related to social science and fisher behavior. Although we know that there's some really great folks who are invested in doing that and there's some examples out there where they are engaging that way. Ultimately, DFO interviewees pointed to a new governance arrangement as a potential solution that could connect different governing actors together who have policies related to fisher behavior across the province and other federal actors. So that's linking DFO's role with policies outside of the regulator context. So now I'm going to go to some key strategies, and these are based on evidence in this chapter that I just described to you, but also insights from previous parts of my dissertation. And the first one is to strengthen governability. I argue that there needs to be a behavioral monitoring strategy. And so this sort of strategy focuses on improving the knowledge with respect to how different fisher behaviors shape change in the inshore fisheries, including changes triggered by policy. And so connecting a scientific framework about fisher behavior with also policies and responsibilities for implementing those policies is a key strategy. And I think the basis for that should be, and sort of already is in the maritime regions, thinking about fisher behavior in relation to stock assessments and annual decisions, particularly related to implications to licenses. The second strategy I call is context-sensitive anticipation strategy. And so there's a need here to not only address fisher behavior, but be able to anticipate it given certain kind of changes in the fishery. And I think the way to do that first is by figuring out opportunities to develop and leverage psychosocial evidence about fisher behavior in relation to different changes in marine environments and coastal communities. And that's building the capacity to anticipate behavior as a lens into different pressures on the resource, into fishing capacity more generally, and capitalization in a fishery. The third is a proactive governance strategy, and this picks up on this interjurisdictional opportunity to connect a bunch of different folks with policies related to fisher behavior in ways that they can coordinate, review, and translate social science about fisher behavior for DFO in the hopes to help anticipate future changes. And the key management approach for that would be management strategy evaluation, where you are looking to kind of anticipate the implications of different management strategies, not only in marine environments, but also in broader coastal communities. So my last slide here is just to say, yes, I contributed to the literature, but also a little bit to practice with respect to those strategies. And I think these insights here can be used in a governance context to really not only better understand change processes, but also recognize social complexity in fisheries through the concept of fisher behavior. And so to do that, I developed this neat typology, understood patterns of behavior that fishers use to cope and adapt, and contributed some neat evidence about emotions, values, and perceptions that can help people in governance really anticipate why fishers are going to change their behavior under different conditions of change more broadly. My research really shows that there's this interdependent relationship between fisher behavior, and policy. Not only is fisher behavior important to policy, but also policy changes influence behavioral change in terms of how fishers are interpreting and anticipating those changes. And quite simply, is a need to think about this relationship more directly in the governance of Canada's Atlantic inshore fisheries by exploring, the barriers and opportunities to incorporate fisher behavior in the policy processes that lead to management decisions that steer change in fisheries. So overall, I hope you take away not only those insights, but just a broad understanding that fisher behavior is this multifaceted construct that not only contributes to change processes, but also is a key construct that can shape other future research and practice that addresses change and behavior in fisheries, including the governance of Canada's Atlantic inshore fisheries. And I think my strategies are reasonably practical ways to do that. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I hope you have lots of questions, and certainly I'm here till the end to chat with you.
All right, thanks, Evan. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself or type it in the chat window there.
Hi, Evan. This is Maria. Hi, I have a question. Thank you for the great presentation.
Sure.
I'm curious about, you mentioned that the fish harvesters are very concerned about access to licenses. I'm wondering, are they more concerned about more access to licenses or access to more quota? What's driving more their behavior?
Yes, it would be shifts in allocations.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, so perhaps I misspoke or miscommunicated that. So they are definitely in the terms of my research very concerned with upwards and downward shifts in allocations, but also some stuff related to spatial and temporal access. So when seasons are going to start and close, and if in the context of something like a competitive fishery, they're really fisher behavior is driven by the selections of those key weeks, also things like the weather during that week. And so there's a bit of both of those things going on, but mostly it's about shifts in allocations.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes.
You said this was designed in the beginning specifically, or I don't know if you said this, but I'm asking, was it designed specifically for the inshore fisheries? And can you take the exact same what you're doing and apply it to the marine fisheries?
Yeah, so the inshore fisheries allowed me a way to sort of bound the empirical work, particularly in the middle chapter. I think the typology, for example, the stuff that's coming out in fish and fisheries, it has been worked to apply to both sort of what we might call inshore fisheries or those coastal fisheries, but also marine fisheries. But we would expect to see maybe some different patterns when applying that typology. Lots of different challenges on the water, but also about where these folks live and how decisions in those different communities shape different pressures on the resource. So that research is designed for a bit more of a broader application. And with respect to recognizing fisher behavior in Atlantic Canada's governance of fisheries, it would also include, fleets that are really owned and operated by an individual. So we can think about inshore, but also the midshore, which gets a little bit towards those marine spaces.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Evan. I have another question.
Thank you.
Yes. So I'm doing work related to recruitment and retention of fish harvest in the industry. And I just wanted to know your thoughts or what you found in your interviews related to people staying in the fishery or having people in their communities come into the fishery, if it was easy for them or what was the feeling that they had related to entry.
Yeah, so the choices about decisions about whether to stay or to go, or once fishers have left to re-enter, were really neat and interesting questions about behavior. And I know that your work might be a little different than this kind of entry point, but entering as behavior really sort of allowed me to look and understand a little bit about those decision-making processes that preceded what are really pretty big decisions. And we can think about exiting, for example, as probably the hardest, most difficult, most emotional decision that fishers have made across their lifetimes. And there were a few examples of that. And we can think post-cod collapse as one a situation, but also now that we're seeing big declines in shrimp or in shellfish quota. And so those kind of really difficult times were ripe for manifesting discussions and decisions about exiting. Exiting I found, is on one level a values oriented behavior. So people are making decisions about whether they can pursue whatever value, their economic or financial goals, or maybe their relationships and well-being in communities in those difficult times, and they're doing it over questions about whether to stay or to go. Fishers most often told me that discussion was happened often over a course of a few seasons where they're trying to make a go of it, but maybe could not, so they left or thought about leaving and then ultimately stayed. Behavior allows us to really think and look into that decision-making process. And what would be interesting, whether it's exit or entry, is linking those kind of emotional discussions related to broader questions of power and access and policies and other things that social scientists do really well, to better understand those patterns and maybe anticipate them. Just quickly, in terms of reentry or entry, those were very interesting stories. We found out that, entry has changed, norms of entry has changed over time, in particular relating to, things like the cost and extensiveness of the decision to enter. Also, more female harvesters are now entering, although the number is reasonably low. But Fisher's talked about how that was really changing over time. But also access to different technologies. So re-entering when some reasonably cost-effective gear is available, re-entering a fishery that perhaps they don't have much history in. So it was a lot of different things, and just sort of personally, I'm happy to share that those interviews that they're summarized, which I can do kind of within the bounds of my ethics with you.
Okay, thank you, Evan. That's a great response. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria.
Hey, well, if there's no other questions, just want to say thank you for coming, Evan. It was a great talk. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining in.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.